The blue lights erupted in Evelyn Brooks's rearview mirror, a searing burst that ripped through the silence of her drive, like a gunshot in the dead of night. Her government-issued black SUV shuddered to a stop on the lonely stretch of Reynolds Road, Toledo, Ohio, the dashboard clock ticking 11:18 p.m. on a freezing Wednesday in January 2025. Her pulse slammed in her chest. Not fear, but the honed instinct of a woman who'd faced down chaos in 2 war zones. Lieutenant Colonel Evelyn Brooks, 46, a soldier who'd earned her Bronze Star through grit and precision, wasn't one to waver. But as a shadowed figure approached, hand heavy on his holster, she knew this wasn't a battlefield. This was a different kind of war, one where the rules were unwritten and the stakes personal. Evelyn's hands gripped the steering wheel, her dark eyes tracking the officer in the side mirror, sharp and unyielding. Her close-cropped hair framed a face sculpted by discipline. High cheekbones, a steady gaze, skin a deep ebony that caught the dashboard's faint glow. Her civilian jacket, simple but tailored, did little to hide the posture of a commander who'd led convoys through deserts and orchestrated relief in disaster zones. She was driving back to Fort Wayne, Indiana, after a grueling meeting 2 hours south, the hum of her tires a quiet rhythm against the weight of the day. Until those lights hit, turning her world electric. Sergeant Nathan Pierce strode toward the SUV, his flashlight cutting the darkness like a blade. At 39, he was a 15-year veteran of the Toledo Police Department, his broad frame and square jaw casting a shadow of authority that silenced rooms. But his eyes, narrow, restless, burning with a need to dominate, revealed a man who thrived on control. His uniform was crisp, boots polished to a mirror shine, but the way his hand rested on his holster wasn't caution, it was a challenge. Parked in his usual spot off Reynolds Road, he'd been sipping stale coffee, the monotony of a quiet shift gnawing at him. Evelyn's sleek SUV, unfamiliar and gliding through the night, was the jolt he needed, a chance to wield the power his badge promised. License and registration, Nathan barked, his voice sharp as he reached her window, no hint of courtesy. Evelyn lowered the tinted glass halfway, her hands visible, her posture calm but immovable, like a general awaiting a report. "Officer, may I ask why I've been stopped?" Her voice was steady, professional, the kind that had steadied soldiers through storms. Nathan squinted, his flashlight's beam stabbing into her face, forcing her to blink against the glare. "You were drifting between lanes. Didn't signal. Looked like you might be impaired." Evelyn's eyebrow arched, a quiet defiance. "I wasn't." Her words were firm, rooted in truth, but Nathan's jaw tightened, a faint scar on his cheek, a relic of a street brawl, twitching faintly. "License and registration," he repeated, louder, leaning in as if his presence could force compliance. She didn't flinch, moving slowly to the glove box, her movements deliberate as she handed over her documents. "This is a government vehicle," she said, her voice unshaken. "I'm a federal employee." Nathan glanced at her ID, Lieutenant Colonel Evelyn Brooks, U.S. Army, but his lips twisted into a smirk, a flash of arrogance. "Military, huh? Doesn't mean you're above the law." "I never said I was," Evelyn replied, her gaze locking onto his, unyielding and piercing. Something in her eyes, calm, resolute, made Nathan's smirk falter, a crack in his facade. But he pressed forward, his voice hardening. "Step out of the vehicle." Evelyn's jaw clenched, her pulse quickening, but her face remained a mask of control. "Excuse me." Nathan's hand twitched near his holster, his stance aggressive. "I said step out. I'm conducting a sobriety check." Her fingers hovered over her phone, instincts from years of high-stakes decisions kicking in. "Document. Stay calm. Protect." "On what grounds?" "I've complied. I haven't been drinking." "I'd like clarification." Nathan's face darkened, his authority challenged in a way that stung. He didn't like it, didn't like her composure, her refusal to bend under his glare. "You're refusing a lawful order," he snapped, yanking open her door with a force that echoed in the still night. Evelyn's heart raced, but she stayed steady, pressing record on her phone, the red light a silent sentinel. "Just so we're clear," she said, her voice low but ironclad. "This interaction is being documented." Nathan's eyes flicked to the phone, a brief hesitation crossing his face, but his pride drowned it out. "Out." Now, Evelyn stepped onto the pavement, her boots hitting with a soft thud. At 5 feet 9 inches, she stood tall, her civilian jacket unable to hide the bearing of a soldier who'd commanded under fire. She didn't shout, didn't resist, but her presence radiated a power that made Nathan pause, a flicker of doubt he couldn't name. He ordered her to walk a straight line under the dim streetlights, treating her like a reckless driver on a bender. Her steps were flawless, her breath steady, no trace of impairment. No slurring, no stumble, only precision. Yet Nathan scribbled a citation for failure to maintain lane, thrusting it at her with a sneer. Evelyn took the ticket, her eyes meeting his for a moment, a look that carried weight, not anger. She slid back into her SUV, the engine's low growl cutting the silence as she pulled away into the dark. Nathan watched her taillights fade, tossing his flashlight onto the passenger seat with a careless flick. Just another stop, he told himself, just another driver who thought they were untouchable. But a quiet voice in his head whispered, "What did you just ignite?" He shook it off, climbing into his cruiser, the coffee cup still warm in his hand. Evelyn drove on, her hands steady, but her mind was a storm. She wasn't angry, not yet. She was strategizing, her thoughts sharp as a blade. She'd faced men like Nathan before, men who mistook a badge for a throne, wielding power without principle. But this wasn't just about her. It was about every soldier she guided, every civilian dismissed or intimidated, every black woman forced to swallow pride to survive. She glanced at her phone, the recording saved, a spark ready to blaze. This ticket, this moment, wasn't the end. It was the beginning, and when it returned, it would light up the dark. Nathan Pierce leaned back in the Toledo West Side Precinct's break room, his boots propped on a worn table, the fluorescent lights buzzing like a distant swarm. His dark hair was clipped short, the scar on his cheek a faint reminder of a brawl he'd ended years ago, a badge of his toughness. At 39, he was a fixture here, 15 years on the force etching a reputation that made younger officers snap to attention. His broad frame filled his chair, but his restless eyes betrayed a hunger for control that his badge amplified. The precinct was his kingdom, the badge his scepter, and he wielded it with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, forged by a system that rarely questioned him. He tossed a bag of chips onto the table, a smirk curling his lips as he turned to Officer Javier Lopez, a younger cop with a quick wit and a knack for reading people. "Some woman tried to pull rank on me last night," Nathan said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Flashed her government ID like it was a get-out-of-jail-free card." Javier paused, his coffee cup hovering, his dark eyes narrowing slightly. "Wait, she was military." Nathan shrugged, his smirk fading just a touch. "So she says." Some fed with a chip on her shoulder. Name was Brooks. Evelyn Brooks. Javier's face shifted, his easy grin replaced by a flicker of concern. "You mean Lieutenant Colonel Brooks?" Nathan's hand froze mid-reach for the chips, his scar twitching faintly. "How the hell would you know that?" Javier leaned forward, his voice low but urgent. "She gave a talk at the academy last year. Runs logistics out of Fort Wayne. Bronze Star, 2 tours overseas. She's not just military, man. She's a big deal." Nathan scoffed, waving it off, but the gesture lacked conviction. "Doesn't matter who she is. On the street, I call the shots." But Javier's words lingered, a splinter in Nathan's armor, sharp and nagging. Across state lines in Fort Wayne, Indiana, Evelyn Brooks sat in her office at the military base, the morning sun slicing through the blinds, casting stripes across her desk. Her space was a study in order, reports stacked neatly, a framed photo of her leading a convoy in Afghanistan, her medals gleaming in a display case. At 46, she was a portrait of precision, her uniform pressed to perfection, her dark eyes sharp with focus. Her ebony skin glowed under the light, her short hair framing a face that carried the weight of command. But last night's stop replayed in her mind like a looped reel, Nathan's flashlight blinding her, his hand on his holster, his voice thick with contempt. She'd faced worse, sandstorms, ambushes, lives on the line, but this hit differently. It wasn't just an insult. It was a challenge to everything she stood for. Sergeant Caleb Hayes, her aide, knocked and stepped in, his broad frame filling the doorway. At 32, Caleb was all muscle and loyalty, his shaved head catching the light, his eyes steady with respect. "You okay, ma'am?" he asked, his voice low, sensing the storm behind her calm. Evelyn looked up, her expression resolute but shadowed. "Not really, Caleb. But I'm handling it." He nodded, reading her tone like a map. "I saw the footage," he said, closing the door. "You want me to get the JAG team involved?" Evelyn's lips twitched, not quite a smile. Already done. By noon, Evelyn had filed a formal complaint with the Office of the Inspector General, attaching her phone recording. She didn't embellish, didn't dramatize, just laid out the facts: an unwarranted stop, an aggressive officer, a ticket with no basis. The military legal network hummed, the video slipping quietly through her chain of command, a spark spreading fast. Attorney Sarah Bennett called her, her voice crackling with energy over the line. "Evelyn, this is dynamite," Sarah said, her words sharp with conviction. "It's not just a bad stop, it's a civil rights violation. We've got him." Evelyn nodded, her gaze fixed on the photo of her convoy, her resolve hardening like steel. Back at the precinct, Nathan logged the citation, tossing his body cam into the charging dock with a careless flick. He didn't know about the complaint, didn't know Evelyn's video was already moving through channels he couldn't touch. To him, it was just another night, another driver put in their place. He laughed it off with Javier, cracking open another bag of chips, but a small knot tightened in his gut. Something about Evelyn's eyes, those steady, unyielding eyes, clung to him. When Javier mentioned her rank again, Nathan's smirk didn't reach his eyes, and the break room's buzz felt a little sharper, a little closer. He brushed it off, but the air had changed, and deep down he knew it. The shield of his badge, once impenetrable, was starting to feel thin. The Toledo West Side Precinct's locker room smelled of sweat and stale coffee, the clang of metal lockers cutting through the low hum of voices. Nathan Pierce leaned against his locker, his uniform half unbuttoned, his broad frame slouched but tense. His scar, a thin line from a street fight years ago, twitched as he tried to keep his face a mask of indifference. At 39, he was used to the precinct's rhythm, the unspoken respect his 15 years on the force commanded. But today, the air felt different, heavier, like the moment before a storm breaks. He turned to Officer Javier Lopez, who was lacing up his boots, his dark eyes cautious. "You're telling me she's some hotshot, Colonel?" Nathan said, his voice sharp, trying to shrug off Javier's warning from the break room. Javier nodded, his expression serious. "Not just any colonel, Nathan. Lieutenant Colonel Evelyn Brooks. She's got pull, serious pull. You might have messed with the wrong person." Nathan snorted, but the sound was hollow, lacking the bravado he usually wore like armor. "She was just a driver. Didn't signal, didn't move fast enough. I did my job." Javier stood, his lean frame taut, his voice low. "You escalated, man. You always escalate. And she's got it on video." Nathan's fingers drummed against the locker, a restless tick betraying the unease creeping into his gut. He didn't want to hear it, didn't want to think about that phone, its red light blinking like an accusation. He turned away, yanking his uniform straight, but Javier's words stuck, a splinter he couldn't pull out. Across the state line in Fort Wayne, Indiana, Evelyn Brooks stood in her office, her fingers tracing a map of supply routes pinned to the wall. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting soft shadows across her desk, where a stack of reports sat beside a framed photo of her leading a relief effort after a hurricane. At 46, she was a study in control, her uniform crisp, her medals a quiet testament to her 22 years of service. Her ebony skin glowed under the light, her dark eyes sharp but haunted as last night's stop replayed in her mind. Nathan's flashlight, his sneering tone, the way he'd looked at her like she was nothing. She'd faced that look before, briefing rooms, deployments, moments when her rank couldn't shield her from being a black woman in a world that often dismissed her. But she'd never let it break her, and she wouldn't now. Attorney Sarah Bennett arrived at the base, her tailored navy suit a stark contrast to the camouflage around her. At 41, Sarah was a force, sharp-witted, relentless, with a reputation for tearing apart weak cases. She sat across from Evelyn, her tablet open to the video, her green eyes glinting with excitement. "This is airtight, Evelyn," she said, tapping the screen. "His body cam, your phone, 2 angles, 1 truth." He had no cause, and he knew it. Evelyn nodded, her face unreadable, but her hands clasped tightly, betraying the fire beneath her calm. I'm not after headlines, Sarah. I want accountability, for him, for the system that lets him act like that. By evening, Evelyn's complaint had reached the Toledo Police Department's internal affairs, a quiet ripple turning into a wave. Captain Michael Vaughn, Nathan's superior, called him into his office, the door shutting with a heavy thud. At 52, Michael was weathered, his graying hair and steady gaze marking a man who'd seen the force's best and worst. He tossed a printout of the complaint onto his desk, his voice low but cutting. "What were you thinking, Pierce? You pulled over a lieutenant colonel, treated her like a suspect, and she's got you on tape." Nathan crossed his arms, his posture defensive, his scar pulsing. She was evasive. "I followed procedure." Michael leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You escalated for no reason, and now it's biting you. This isn't going away." Nathan left the office, his confidence fraying like a worn rope. The precinct felt different now. Whispers in the halls, eyes sliding away from his. He told himself it was nothing, that the system would cover him as it always had. But as he drove home, Evelyn's face flashed in his mind, those steady eyes, that unshakable calm. For the first time, he wondered if he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. The badge that had always felt like a shield now weighed like a chain, and the precinct's silence followed him into the night. Nathan Pierce sat alone in his cruiser, parked in a quiet Toledo alley, the hum of the engine a low drone against the January chill. His scar itched under the faint streetlight, a reminder of the fights, physical and otherwise, that had defined his 15 years on the force. At 39, he was a man who thrived on control, his broad frame and sharp jaw making him a presence that commanded respect, or at least fear. But tonight, his restless eyes darted to the dashboard, replaying the stop with Evelyn Brooks. He'd been a rookie once, breaking up bar fights with a swagger that earned him nods from veterans. Over the years, he'd escalated minor calls, barked orders at drivers, and leaned hard on his badge, knowing the system would back him. Complaints had come before, angry motorists, loud teens, but they'd always vanished, buried by union reps or a captain's shrug. This time, though, Javier Lopez's warning echoed. "She's not just anyone." Nathan pushed it down, gripping the wheel, but the doubt lingered, a crack in the armor he'd built. In Fort Wayne, Evelyn Brooks stood at her office window, the military base stretching out under the gray Indiana sky. Her desk was orderly, a stack of logistics reports beside a photo of her commanding a supply run in Iraq, her medals gleaming in their case. At 46, she was a vision of discipline, her ebony skin catching the light, her dark eyes sharp with purpose. But the stop haunted her, not just Nathan's aggression, but the ease with which he'd dismissed her. She'd faced that before, in boardrooms and battlefields, where her rank as a lieutenant colonel couldn't always shield her from being a black woman. Each time, she'd turned it into fuel, earning her Bronze Star through relentless competence. This time, it wasn't just about her. It was about every person who'd been diminished by a badge, every soldier she mentored who deserved better. She turned from the window, her resolve a quiet fire, ready to burn through the system's hold. Attorney Sarah Bennett sat in a sleek Fort Wayne coffee shop, her laptop open to Nathan's body cam footage, her green eyes narrowing as she paused on a frame. Nathan's hand on his holster, his sneer unmistakable. At 41, Sarah was a legal shark, her tailored suit and sharp mind a lethal combination. She'd taken Evelyn's case not just for its strength, but for what it represented, a chance to crack the shield that protected officers like Nathan. "We've got his footage," she told Evelyn over the phone, her voice electric. "It matches your video perfectly. No probable cause, just ego. This is a civil rights case, and it's solid." Evelyn, sitting in her office, nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of her desk. "I want it to mean something, Sarah. Not just for me." The video was spreading through military channels, a spark catching fire, and Sarah knew it could light up more than one precinct. Back in Toledo, Nathan walked into the precinct, the usual buzz of radios and chatter feeling sharper, like a blade grazing his skin. He'd laughed off Javier's warning, but now the locker room glances stung. Captain Michael Vaughn had called him in again, his gray eyes heavy with warning. "Internal Affairs is digging, Pierce," he said, his voice low. "This isn't some speeding ticket. You picked the wrong fight." Nathan's scar pulsed as he deflected, insisting he'd done nothing wrong, but the words felt thin. He'd always leaned on the system. Union reps, quick dismissals. But now, Evelyn's video was out there, a truth he couldn't bury. As he left the precinct, the weight of his badge felt different, not a shield but a target, and the cracks in his confidence began to spread. The Toledo Police Department's Internal Affairs Office was a stark room, its gray walls and fluorescent lights casting a cold glow over Nathan Pierce. He sat across from a stern investigator, his broad shoulders hunched, his scar twitching under the scrutiny. At 39, he was used to being the one in control, his 15 years on the force a testament to his ability to bend situations to his will. But today, the questions came fast. Why the stop? Why the escalation? Why the sobriety test with no evidence? Nathan's answers were clipped, his voice tight, insisting he'd followed protocol. She was evasive, he said, but the investigator's raised eyebrow told him the body cam footage said otherwise. Outside, the precinct buzzed with whispers, officers glancing away as Nathan passed, his usual swagger faltering. Captain Michael Vaughn stood by, his graying hair catching the light, his face grim. "You're on thin ice, Pierce," he said, his voice low. "This is bigger than you think." Nathan's scar burned as he left, the system that had always protected him now feeling like a net closing in. In Fort Wayne, Evelyn Brooks led a briefing in a base conference room, her voice steady as she outlined a supply mission, her dark eyes commanding the attention of her team. At 46, she was a beacon of discipline, her uniform crisp, her ebony skin glowing under the overhead lights. But her mind kept drifting to the stop, Nathan's sneer, the way he dismissed her rank, her identity. She'd faced that dismissal before, in moments when her Bronze Star and 2 decades of service couldn't shield her from bias. This fight wasn't just hers. It was for every soldier she trained, every civilian who'd faced a badge's weight. Sergeant Caleb Hayes, her aide, lingered after the briefing, his broad frame steady, his eyes concerned. "You holding up, ma'am?" he asked. Evelyn's lips pressed tight, her resolve unwavering. "I'm fighting, Caleb." "That's enough." Attorney Sarah Bennett worked late in her Fort Wayne office, her desk littered with case files, her green eyes locked on Nathan's body cam footage. At 41, she was relentless, her sharp mind dissecting every frame. Nathan's aggressive posture, his hand on his holster, his voice dripping with contempt. She'd uncovered a pattern, other complaints against Nathan, buried by the system, and it fueled her. She called Evelyn, her voice sharp with purpose. "We've got more than the stop, Evelyn. He's got a history, and it's not pretty. This is a chance to change things." Evelyn, standing in her office, nodded, her fingers brushing the photo of her convoy. "Then let's make it count." The complaint was gaining traction, the military network amplifying its reach, and Sarah knew the net was tightening, not just on Nathan but on the system that enabled him. Nathan drove home, the Toledo streets blurring past, his hands tight on the wheel. The precinct's silence followed him, the glances from colleagues cutting deeper than he'd admit. He'd always been untouchable, his badge a shield against complaints, but now Evelyn's video loomed, a truth he couldn't dodge. He replayed the stop in his mind, her calm, her defiance, the way she'd held that phone. For the first time, he felt the system's hold slipping, and the weight of his badge pressed harder, a chain he couldn't shake. As he pulled into his driveway, the night felt colder, the net closing tighter, and he knew the fight was far from over. Sarah Bennett's Fort Wayne office was a hive of focus, the late January light filtering through the window, illuminating stacks of files and a laptop open to Nathan Pierce's body cam footage. At 41, Sarah was a legal dynamo, her navy suit sharp, her green eyes blazing with determination as she paused on a frame. Nathan's hand hovering near his holster, his sneer unmistakable. She dug deeper, uncovering a trail of complaints against him. Minor incidents swept under the rug, a pattern of aggression the Toledo PD had ignored. Each file was a piece of the puzzle, and Sarah was building a case that could crack more than one officer's career. She called Evelyn Brooks, her voice electric. "We've got him, Evelyn. His history, the footage, it's a slam dunk. This isn't just about one stop. It's about a system that lets this happen." Evelyn, standing in her base office, her dark eyes fixed on a map, nodded. "Make it stick, Sarah. For everyone." At Fort Wayne, Evelyn led a training exercise, her boots crunching on the frozen ground as she directed recruits through a logistics drill. At 46, she was a pillar of strength, her ebony skin catching the cold sunlight, her uniform a testament to her 22 years of service. Her Bronze Star wasn't just a medal. It was a symbol of her ability to navigate chaos with precision. But Nathan's stop lingered in her mind. The way he dismissed her, the ease of his aggression. She'd faced that before, in moments when her rank couldn't shield her identity as a black woman. This fight was personal, but it was also universal, a stand for every person who'd been diminished by unchecked power. Sergeant Caleb Hayes watched her, his broad frame steady, his eyes proud. "You're going to win this, ma'am," he said after the drill. Evelyn's gaze was steel. "It's not about winning, Caleb. It's about what's right." In Toledo, Nathan Pierce sat in the precinct break room, the buzz of radios and chatter grating on his nerves. His scar pulsed as he sipped coffee, his broad frame slouched, his restless eyes darting to the door. The internal affairs meeting had shaken him. His answers hadn't landed, the investigators' questions too sharp. Captain Michael Vaughn had warned him the case was escalating, and now colleagues avoided his gaze, their whispers a low hum. Officer Javier Lopez, usually quick with a joke, sat across from him, his face serious. "You seen the footage yet, Nathan?" he asked. Nathan's jaw tightened. "I don't need to. I know what happened." But Javier's look said otherwise, and Nathan felt the walls closing in. The system that had always protected him was faltering, and Evelyn's video was a spotlight he couldn't escape. Nathan drove to a quiet bar after his shift, the neon lights casting a dim glow over his face. He ordered a beer, his fingers drumming on the counter, replaying the stop. Evelyn's calm, her unyielding stare, the red light of her phone, it haunted him. He'd always been the one in control, but now doubt crept in, a crack widening with every whisper at the precinct. Sarah's case was building, the military network amplifying Evelyn's complaint, and Nathan's colleagues were pulling back, leaving him isolated. The badge on his chest felt heavier, not a shield but a burden, and as he stared into his drink, he knew the evidence was coming into focus, a truth he couldn't outrun. Nathan Pierce sat in a Toledo diner, the clink of dishes and hum of conversation a backdrop to his meeting with his lawyer, Richard Coleman. At 39, Nathan's broad frame filled the booth, his scar a faint line under the dim light, but his restless eyes betrayed the cracks in his confidence. Richard, a slick attorney with a reputation for defending cops, leaned forward, his suit crisp, his voice smooth. "We'll frame it as procedure, Nathan. You were doing your job, suspicious driver, late night, standard check." Nathan nodded, his jaw tight, but the memory of Evelyn Brooks's steady gaze gnawed at him. "She wasn't suspicious," he muttered, almost to himself. Richard raised an eyebrow, but pressed on. "Doesn't matter. We'll make it about your discretion, not her rank." Nathan wanted to believe it, but the precinct's whispers and Captain Michael Vaughn's warnings told him this wasn't just another complaint. The system that had always shielded him was wavering, and the battle lines were being drawn. In Fort Wayne, Evelyn Brooks met with attorney Sarah Bennett in a base conference room, the walls lined with maps and mission plans. At 46, Evelyn was a vision of command, her uniform pressed, her ebony skin glowing under the fluorescent lights, her dark eyes sharp with purpose. Sarah, 41, sat across from her, her green eyes blazing as she outlined their strategy. "We're not just going for a win, Evelyn. We're exposing a pattern. Pierce's history, the department's blind eye. This is a civil rights case with teeth." Evelyn nodded, her fingers brushing a photo of her leading a convoy, her Bronze Star a quiet reminder of her resilience. She'd faced bias before, moments when her rank couldn't shield her identity as a black woman. But this fight was bigger, for her soldiers, for every civilian dismissed by a badge. "Make it count, Sarah," she said, her voice steady but fierce. The Toledo community was starting to buzz, the case leaking into local forums and coffee shop talks. Officer Javier Lopez overheard colleagues debating in the precinct locker room, some defending Nathan's tough cop style, others questioning his aggression. Javier, his lean frame tense, stayed quiet, his respect for Evelyn clashing with his loyalty to the force. Captain Michael Vaughn felt the pressure too, his graying hair catching the light as he fielded calls from higher-ups. The complaint was no longer just internal. It was gaining traction, with Evelyn's video circulating through military and legal channels. Nathan felt the shift, his usual swagger fading as colleagues avoided his eyes, their silence louder than any reprimand. Evelyn stood on the Fort Wayne base's training field, watching recruits run drills, her presence a beacon of strength. Sergeant Caleb Hayes lingered nearby, his broad frame steady, his eyes proud. "This case is shaking things up, ma'am," he said. Evelyn's gaze was fixed on the horizon, her mind on the stop. Nathan's sneer, the weight of his badge. "It's not about shaking things, Caleb. It's about breaking what's broken." The battle lines were clear now, and as Sarah prepared their case, Evelyn knew the courtroom was coming. Nathan, meanwhile, sat in his cruiser, the Toledo streets dark and quiet, his scar pulsing as he gripped the wheel. The system had always held, but now, with Evelyn's resolve and Sarah's evidence, the lines were drawn, and the fight was about to begin. The Lucas County Civil Courtroom was a crucible of tension, its wooden benches packed with a quiet crowd as Evelyn Brooks stepped through the doors. At 46, she was a vision in her service uniform, her medals gleaming under the fluorescent lights, her ebony skin catching the glow, her dark eyes steady with purpose. Her presence silenced whispers, her lieutenant colonel's rank clear in every measured step. Nathan Pierce sat at the defense table, his broad frame stiff in a gray suit, his scar a faint line under the harsh light. At 39, he was used to commanding scenes, but today his restless eyes darted, his confidence fraying. Judge Margaret Hayes, a stern woman with silver-streaked hair and piercing blue eyes, called the room to order, her gavel a sharp crack that set the stage. Evelyn took the stand, her posture impeccable, her voice clear as she recounted the January stop. "I was driving within the lines, sober, compliant," she said, her words cutting through the room. Officer Pierce demanded I exit the vehicle without cause, his tone aggressive, his hand on his holster. Attorney Sarah Bennett, 41, stood beside her, her navy suit sharp, her green eyes locked on the jury as she guided Evelyn's testimony. The jury, a mix of Toledo locals, their faces unreadable, leaned in, drawn by Evelyn's calm authority. Sarah played the phone video, the screen showing Nathan's flashlight in Evelyn's face, his voice barking orders. Then came his body cam, mirroring the scene, his sneer, his escalation, her unflappable calm. The room went still, the footage a damning truth. Nathan's scar pulsed as he watched, his hands clenched under the table. His lawyer, Richard Coleman, leaned in, whispering strategy, but Nathan's mind was on Evelyn, her medals, her rank, the way she carried herself. He'd seen her as just a driver, someone to control, but now her presence filled the courtroom, a force he couldn't dismiss. Sarah's questions hammered home the lack of probable cause, and the jury's silence felt like a weight on Nathan's chest. Officer Javier Lopez, seated in the back, watched with conflicted eyes, his respect for Evelyn growing. Captain Michael Vaughn, there to support the department, shifted uncomfortably, knowing the footage was a blow the precinct couldn't dodge. Evelyn stepped down, her gaze meeting Nathan's for a fleeting moment. Not anger, but resolve. The courtroom felt heavier, the air thick with the truth laid bare. Richard tried to counter, questioning Evelyn's motives, suggesting she'd provoked Nathan, but her calm answers disarmed him. "I recorded because I know silence isn't protection," she said, her voice steady, and the jury nodded, their faces softening. Nathan's defense felt thin, his scar burning under the scrutiny, and as the day ended, he knew the courtroom's weight was shifting, pulling him toward a reckoning he hadn't seen coming. Nathan Pierce took the stand in the Lucas County courtroom, his broad frame stiff in a gray suit, his scar a faint pulse under the fluorescent lights. At 39, he was used to being the one in control, his 15 years on the force a shield against scrutiny. But today, his restless eyes betrayed him, darting to the jury as attorney Sarah Bennett paced, her green eyes sharp with intent. "Sergeant Pierce," she began, her voice cutting, "why did you ask Colonel Brooks to exit her vehicle?" Nathan's jaw tightened, his answers clipped. She seemed evasive. "I was ensuring safety." Sarah's eyebrow arched, her navy suit crisp as she played the body cam footage again. Nathan's aggressive tone, his hand on his holster, Evelyn's calm compliance. The jury leaned forward, their faces unreadable but tense. Evelyn sat at the plaintiff's table, her service uniform pristine, her medals catching the light, her ebony skin glowing with quiet strength. At 46, she was a beacon of discipline, her dark eyes fixed on Nathan, not with anger but with a resolve that filled the room. Sarah's cross-examination was relentless, dismantling Nathan's defense. Did she refuse any orders? Raise her voice. Show signs of impairment. Nathan hesitated, his scar twitching. No, he admitted, his voice low, and the courtroom's silence grew heavier. His lawyer, Richard Coleman, tried to redirect, painting Nathan as a diligent officer, but the footage spoke louder, and Nathan's answers faltered, his confidence crumbling under Sarah's precision. The jury watched Evelyn, her presence commanding even in silence. Her testimony had set the tone, calm, factual, unyielding, and now Nathan's stand felt like a contrast, his aggression laid bare. Officer Javier Lopez, in the gallery, shifted, his lean frame tense, his respect for Evelyn clashing with his loyalty to the force. Captain Michael Vaughn, seated nearby, knew the department was taking a hit, his gray eyes heavy with the case's weight. Sarah ended with a final question. If you'd known her rank, would you have acted differently? Nathan's voice dropped, a rare slip of honesty. Maybe. The admission hung in the air, a crack in his armor, and the jury's silence signaled a shift. As Nathan stepped down, his scar burned, his hands clenched. Evelyn's gaze met his, steady and unflinching, a reminder of the truth he couldn't escape. The courtroom adjourned, the jury sent to deliberate, their faces a mix of resolve and uncertainty. Evelyn stood, her medals gleaming, her mind on the broader fight, for her soldiers, for every civilian dismissed by a badge. Nathan left the room, the weight of his badge heavier than ever, knowing the stand had changed everything, and the verdict was coming. The Lucas County courtroom was a pressure cooker, its air thick with anticipation as attorney Sarah Bennett stood to deliver her closing argument. At 41, she was a force, her navy suit sharp, her green eyes blazing as she faced the jury. This case isn't just about a traffic stop, she said, her voice ringing with conviction. It's about a system that lets officers like Sergeant Pierce wield power without accountability. Colonel Brooks was compliant, sober, driving a government vehicle. Yet she was treated like a threat, her rights violated, her dignity dismissed. She gestured to Evelyn, seated at the plaintiff's table, her service uniform pristine, her medals gleaming, her ebony skin glowing under the lights. At 46, Evelyn's dark eyes were steady, her presence a quiet storm that held the room. Sarah played the footage one last time. Evelyn's phone video, Nathan's body cam, the dual truths undeniable. Nathan's sneer, his aggressive posture, his hand on his holster filled the screen, and the jury's faces tightened, their silence deafening. This isn't just about one night, Sarah continued. It's about every person who's faced a badge and been forced to shrink. Colonel Brooks didn't shrink. She stood, and she's asking you to hold Sergeant Pierce accountable. The words landed like a gavel, and Evelyn nodded, her resolve a beacon for the jury. Nathan Pierce sat at the defense table, his broad frame hunched, his scar pulsing under the courtroom's harsh light. At 39, he was used to being untouchable, his 15 years on the force's shield. But today, his restless eyes avoided the jury, his confidence shattered by Sarah's words. His lawyer, Richard Coleman, stood, his suit crisp but his tone strained. Sergeant Pierce followed procedure. He argued, his voice lacking conviction. Late-night stop, unfamiliar vehicle. He acted to ensure safety. But the footage loomed, undermining his words, and Nathan's hands clenched, knowing the defense was crumbling. Evelyn watched, her mind drifting to her 22 years of service, the moments when her rank couldn't shield her from bias. This fight wasn't just hers. It was for every soldier she led, every civilian dismissed by power. Officer Javier Lopez, in the gallery, felt the weight, his respect for Evelyn growing. Captain Michael Vaughn, seated nearby, knew the precinct would feel the fallout. As the jury filed out to deliberate, their silence was a storm waiting to break. Evelyn stood, her medals heavy but her heart steady, knowing the final arguments had set the stage for justice, and Nathan's badge was no longer a shield. The Lucas County courtroom was quieter now, the benches half empty as the jury returned after 3 days of deliberation. Evelyn Brooks sat at the plaintiff's table, her service uniform crisp, her medals catching the faint light, her ebony skin glowing with quiet strength. At 46, she was a pillar of resolve, her dark eyes steady as she waited for Judge Margaret Hayes to speak. Nathan Pierce, at the defense table, was a shadow of his usual self, his broad frame slumped, his scar pulsing under the fluorescent glow. At 39, his 15 years on the force had always made him untouchable, but today, his restless eyes avoided the jury, his hands clenched tight. The air was thick, the silence a weight pressing on everyone. Judge Hayes, her silver-streaked hair catching the light, shuffled her papers, her blue eyes sharp. In the matter of Brooks versus Pierce, she began, her voice clear. The jury has found in favor of the plaintiff. Evelyn's face didn't change, but her fingers tightened around her pen, a quiet victory. Nathan's scar burned, his breath catching as the judge continued. The court recognizes a violation of constitutional rights during an unlawful stop and detainment. Sergeant Pierce's actions were not aligned with department policy or professional conduct. The words hit like a hammer, and Nathan's lawyer, Richard Coleman, whispered about an appeal, but his voice lacked conviction. The judge awarded $35,000 in damages, the ruling to remain on public record and forwarded to the Department of Justice and Toledo Police Department for review. Evelyn nodded once, not to the judge or jury, but to herself, a confirmation of the fight she'd chosen. Nathan's face paled, his scar a stark line as he stood, the weight of his badge heavier than ever. Officer Javier Lopez, in the back, watched with conflicted eyes, his respect for Evelyn solidifying. Captain Michael Vaughn, nearby, knew the precinct would face scrutiny, his gray eyes heavy with the fallout. Outside, Evelyn paused in the hallway, her phone buzzing with a notification, asterisk verdict in your favor. Case closed. Asterisk Sarah Bennett caught up, her green eyes bright. You could have pushed for more, she said. Evelyn shook her head, her voice low. It was never about the money. Nathan, meanwhile, paced outside the courthouse, dodging a handful of local reporters, his scar burning as cameras flashed. He climbed into his car, the verdict echoing in his mind, a truth he couldn't outrun. Evelyn walked to her SUV, her medals gleaming, her resolve unbroken, knowing the verdict was just the beginning of a larger fight. The Toledo streets buzzed with the verdict's fallout. Local news vans parked outside the Lucas County Courthouse, their cameras catching Nathan Pierce as he ducked into his car. At 39, his broad frame was tense, his scar a stark line under the flashing lights, his restless eyes avoiding the reporters shouting questions. His 15 years on the force had made him untouchable, but now his badge felt like a target, the public record of his misconduct a stain he couldn't scrub. He drove off, the radio humming with talk of Colonel Brooks versus the Toledo PD, the story spreading like wildfire. His lawyer, Richard Coleman, had promised an appeal, but Nathan's confidence was gone, replaced by a gnawing shame he wouldn't admit. In Fort Wayne, Evelyn Brooks returned to her base, her office a haven of order, her desk lined with reports and a photo of her leading a relief effort. At 46, her ebony skin glowed under the morning light, her dark eyes sharp as she reviewed mission plans. She'd declined interviews, her focus on her duties, but the case's ripples reached her, soldiers whispering her name, proud of her stand. Sergeant Caleb Hayes stopped by, his broad frame steady, his eyes bright. "You're a legend now, ma'am," he said, half smiling. Evelyn's lips twitched, her voice firm. "I'm just a soldier, Caleb, doing what's right." Her medals gleamed, a reminder of her 22 years of service, but her mind was on the broader fight, for every person dismissed by power. Toledo's community was alight with debate, coffee shops, and online forums buzzing with opinions. Some defended Nathan, calling him a tough cop doing his job. Others praised Evelyn, her video a rallying cry for reform. Officer Javier Lopez felt the divide at the precinct, his lean frame tense as colleagues argued in the break room. His respect for Evelyn grew, but loyalty to the force kept him quiet. Captain Michael Vaughn faced pressure from above, his graying hair catching the light as he fielded calls about policy reviews. The case was a spark, igniting talks of change, and Evelyn's footage was everywhere, a symbol of resistance. Evelyn stood on the Fort Wayne training field, watching recruits drill, her presence a beacon of strength. She thought of her mother, a civil rights advocate who'd taught her to stand firm, and the soldiers she led, who deserved a world where justice wasn't a fight. The public storm was growing, but Evelyn stayed focused, her resolve a quiet fire. Nathan, meanwhile, sat in his apartment, the TV flashing with news of the case, his scar pulsing as he gripped his badge. The system's hold was slipping, and the storm was far from over. Nathan Pierce sat in his Toledo apartment, the blinds drawn, the TV muted but flashing with news of the Brooks case. At 39, his broad frame was slumped, his scar a stark line under the dim light, his restless eyes fixed on the badge in his hands. The Toledo PD had placed him on administrative leave, the verdict's fallout a weight he couldn't shake. His 15 years on the force had been his identity, his badge a shield, but now it felt like a chain, dragging him down. Captain Michael Vaughn had delivered the news, his gray eyes heavy with disappointment. "This is bigger than you, Pierce," he'd said. "The department's under a microscope now." Nathan's scar burned as he replayed the stop. Evelyn's calm, her phone's red light, the way he'd underestimated her. He wanted to fight, to appeal, but the shame was creeping in, a truth he couldn't dodge. In Fort Wayne, Evelyn Brooks returned to her duties, her office a sanctuary of order, her desk lined with reports and a photo of her leading a convoy. At 46, her ebony skin glowed under the morning light, her dark eyes sharp as she prepared for a mission briefing. The verdict hadn't changed her. She wasn't seeking fame, only justice, but its ripples reached her. Soldiers nodded with respect, her name a quiet legend on the base. Sergeant Caleb Hayes stopped by, his broad frame steady, his eyes proud. "You changed things, ma'am," he said. Evelyn's gaze was firm, her voice low. "Not yet, Caleb, but it's a start." Her medals gleamed, a testament to her 22 years of service, but her mind was on the fight, for her soldiers, for every civilian who'd faced a badge's weight. The Toledo PD faced scrutiny, the verdict sparking policy reviews and community demands for reform. Officer Javier Lopez felt the tension in the precinct, his lean frame tense as colleagues debated the case. Some still backed Nathan, but others saw Evelyn's stand as a wake-up call. The Department of Justice had taken notice, their review looming like a storm cloud. Evelyn's video was everywhere, shared online, a symbol of resistance that fueled protests and discussions. Captain Michael Vaughn met with city officials, his graying hair catching the light as he pushed for training changes, knowing the case could reshape the force. Evelyn stood on the Fort Wayne training field, watching recruits march, her presence a quiet force. She thought of the stop, the courtroom, the verdict, not as a victory, but as a step. Her mother's voice echoed. Asterisk stand firm, Evelyn. Always. Asterisk the aftermath was unfolding, and as Nathan grappled with his fall, Evelyn prepared to teach, her resolve unbroken, ready to carry the fight forward. Evelyn Brooks stood before a room of recruits at Fort Wayne, her service uniform pristine, her medals gleaming under the lecture hall's lights. At 46, she was a vision of strength, her ebony skin glowing, her dark eyes locking onto each young soldier, her presence commanding silence. The recruits, fresh-faced and eager, sat straight, their uniforms crisp, their eyes wide with respect. Evelyn's voice was steady, carrying the weight of her 22 years of service, her Bronze Star a testament to her leadership. "I'm not here to talk about tactics today," she began, her words clear, resonating. "I'm here to talk about what it means to lead when no one's watching, when the world expects you to shrink." She recounted the January stop, her voice calm but powerful, describing Nathan Pierce's aggression, the flashlight in her face, the ticket with no cause. "I could have shouted, panicked, or let it go," she said, her eyes sweeping the room. "I didn't. I recorded, I filed, I stood in court. Not for me, but for every one of you, for every person who's faced power without principle." The recruits leaned forward, a female soldier in the back gripping her pen, her eyes bright with connection. Evelyn's mother's voice echoed in her mind. Asterisk stand firm, Evelyn asterisk, and she saw it in these young faces, a new generation hungry to serve with integrity. Nathan Pierce sat in a Toledo bar, the neon lights casting shadows across his scar, his badge tucked away in his pocket. At 39, his broad frame was slumped, his restless eyes staring into a beer. The administrative leave had stretched into weeks, his career hanging by a thread. The precinct's silence, the media's glare, the verdict's weight, it all pressed on him, his once untouchable status shattered. He thought of Evelyn, her calm in the courtroom, her medals gleaming, and for the first time, he wondered what his badge really meant. Captain Michael Vaughn had warned him the department was changing, and Nathan felt the ground shifting, his identity unmoored. Back at Fort Wayne, Evelyn stepped off the platform, the recruit's silence not one of disinterest but of impact. Sergeant Caleb Hayes waited by the door, his broad frame steady, his eyes proud. "You gave them something real today, ma'am," he said. Evelyn nodded, her medals heavy but her heart light. "It's not about me, Caleb. It's about them." The case had sparked change, Toledo's policy reviews, the DOJ's scrutiny, a community demanding accountability. Evelyn's stand was a legacy, not of fame, but of leadership, a call to courage that would echo beyond the courtroom, beyond the base, into a world that needed it most.